There's a thing about small towns that nobody tells you until it's too late. They remember. Not the way you and I remember, selectively, mercifully, letting certain things blur at the edges until they're almost bearable. No, small towns remember the way stone remembers water. Permanently. Every groove, every crack, every stain becomes part of the landscape, and the people who caused those marks, they become the marks themselves. I rode into Cimarron Creek in the autumn of 1882 with $11 tucked inside my left boot, a horse that limped on wet mornings, and a leather notebook I'd been carrying since the day I buried my brother in a Kansas field nobody will ever name. That notebook, I called it my ledger, had nothing to do with money. I wrote down debts. Not the kind you settle with coin, but the kind that settle you. Kindnesses I'd received and never repaid. Wrongs I'd done that I couldn't take back. Questions I'd asked God that never got an answer, not even a whisper. On the third page, I'd written, "Figure out what a man owes the world when the world has given him nothing but silence." I never did figure that out, but a woman in that town came closer to answering it than anything else in my 41 years of drifting across this cracked and beautiful earth. And the town, the whole blessed, bitter, whispering town, tried to make sure I never heard her answer. This is what happened, and I'm telling you now because somebody should know the truth of it before the stone remembers it wrong. The first time I saw Celia Whitfield, she was pulling a splinter out of a mule's hoof in front of Hadley's feed store, and 3 women across the street were watching her like she was skinning something alive. I remember the details because I wrote them down that night. I always write things down. It's a sickness, probably, this need to account for everything, to keep a record, as if the world might forget what happened and I'd be the only one left to testify. My brother used to say, "Caleb, you don't trust your own memory enough to let it do its job." He was right. I don't trust anything that lives only inside my head because I've seen what the head does to truth over time. It sands it down. Makes it rounder, smoother, easier to hold. I don't want easier, I want accurate. So here's what I saw, accurately. The mule was a sorry-looking gray thing, ribs showing through a coat that hadn't been brushed since summer. It stood in the mud with one foreleg lifted, patient and resigned, the way animals get when they've given up on being treated gently and have decided to simply endure. The woman crouched beside it had her sleeves rolled above her elbows. Her hair was dark brown, almost black in the shade, pulled back in a way that wasn't quite the fashion, looser than the other women in town wore theirs, twisted and pinned with what looked like a piece of carved bone rather than a proper clip. She was talking to the mule, not cooing at it, not baby-talking it the way some people do with animals to perform kindness for whoever might be watching. She was talking to it low and steady, the same way you'd talk to a man who was frightened but trying not to show it. I couldn't hear the words from across the street, but I could hear the rhythm of them, and it had a quality I hadn't encountered before. Something in the cadence that didn't belong to English, exactly, though the words themselves were English. Like the language had been learned in a place where other rhythms lived first. The 3 women watching from under the awning of the dry goods store, Mrs. Hadley among them, I'd later learn, weren't bothering to hide their expressions. One had her arms crossed. Another leaned toward the third and said something behind her hand, and all 3 of them looked at the woman by the mule the way you look at a stain you've been meaning to scrub off the floor for months, but haven't gotten around to because part of you has started to enjoy pointing it out to visitors. I noticed it, I wrote it down, and then I walked into the feed store because I needed oats and my horse needed new shoes, and I had no business standing in the street, cataloging the social habits of women I didn't know. But I thought about her that night in the room I'd rented above the saloon, a room that smelled like pipe smoke and loneliness, which might be the same thing, and I couldn't figure out why. Cimarron Creek was the kind of town that had been promised a railroad and never got one. You could feel that disappointment in everything, the way the buildings leaned slightly, as if they'd been bracing for progress and then slumped when it didn't come. The main street was wide enough for the traffic it would never have. The church was too big for the congregation. The schoolhouse had been built for 50 children but held 19, and 3 of those belonged to the same family. I hadn't planned to stay. I was moving south toward the Picos, where a man named Garrett, not that Garrett, a different one, a cattle buyer, had sent word through a mutual acquaintance that he needed hands for a winter drive. The work would be brutal, the pay fair, and the company sparse, which suited me. I'd spent the last 2 years moving from job to job across the territory, sleeping in line camps and bunkhouses, and occasionally under open sky when both money and patience ran out. and I'd gotten comfortable with the rhythm of impermanence. You don't build anything, you don't lose anything. That was the arrangement I'd made with the world after Kansas. But my horse threw a shoe outside of town, and the blacksmith, a wide, quiet man named Orrin Hawes who smelled perpetually of iron and chewing tobacco, told me the repair would take 2 days because he was backed up with work from the Hollister Ranch. So I stayed. The saloon was called the Copper Penny, which was optimistic given that nothing about it shone. I sat in a corner that first evening with a plate of beans that tasted like apology and a glass of whiskey that tasted like regret. And I listened the way I always listen, not because I'm nosy, but because silence makes people uncomfortable, and uncomfortable people fill silence with truth. It took less than an hour for someone to mention her. That Whitfield woman, a man at the bar said, heavy-set, sunburned, ranch dust still in the creases of his neck. She put a poultice on Bill Farrow's arm last week. Some kind of mud and leaf thing. You know where she learned that. He said you know where she learned that the way a man says something when he wants to communicate disgust, without being explicit enough to be called on it. Bill says the swelling went down inside a day, another man offered. Rattlesnake venom goes down too, the first man said. Don't mean it's good for you. The bartender, who I'd later learn was named Sykes, wiped the same spot on the bar he'd been wiping for the last 10 minutes. She keeps to herself mostly, he said, in a tone that was carefully neutral, the tone of a man who'd learned that having opinions in a small town was more expensive than having debts. I didn't ask, I didn't have to. The heavy-set man was already turning to the room, warming to his audience. 11 years, he said. 11 years she lived with them, Chiricahua Apache. She was taken at 8 years old up near Ojo Calient from a homestead raid, her father killed, mother killed, 2 brothers killed. She was taken, and she didn't come back until she was 19. He paused, letting that settle. 19, he repeated. You think about what a girl becomes in 11 years living that life. You think about what she learned and what she forgot. And then you tell me whether you want that woman putting her hands on your children's cuts and scrapes. Nobody said anything, but nobody argued either. I went upstairs and opened my ledger. On a fresh page I wrote, Woman named Whitfield, town afraid of her, ask why, really why, when the moment's right. And then below it, also, a man who compares healing to rattlesnake venom is a man who's afraid of things that work in ways he can't explain. I met her properly on my second day. It happened the way most important things in my life have happened, not through intention, but through a horse. My bay gelding, Pepper, named by someone else. I'd never have named a horse Pepper, had developed a hot spot on his left foreleg above the shoe line, and Orrin Hawes, who was competent with iron but nervous around anything medical, suggested I take the horse to Miss Whitfield. She's good with animals, he said, then looked away, as if he'd been caught admitting something dangerous. Her place was on the eastern edge of town, not quite in it, not quite out of it, which I suspected was exactly the point. A small adobe house with a covered porch, a garden that grew things I didn't immediately recognize, and a fenced area behind it where a goat stood on top of an overturned water trough and stared at me with the absolute moral superiority that only goats possess. She came out before I knocked. I think she heard Pepper's hooves on the packed earth of her path and had already assessed the gate. He's favoring the left 4, she said, not a question. He is. She walked to Pepper and put her hand flat on his neck before doing anything else. Just stood there, palm against him, still and breathing. He dropped his head by an inch, which for Pepper was the equivalent of total surrender. That horse didn't trust me half as easily as he trusted her, and I'd been feeding him for 2 years. May I, she said, and gestured toward his leg. Please. She crouched and ran her hands down the leg with a touch that was both firm and impossibly gentle. The kind of touch that communicates I know this might hurt, and I'm not going to pretend it won't, but I'm going to be careful. She found the spot. Pepper flinched. She didn't pull away. It's not deep, she said. The skin's irritated from where the shoe shifted. I'll make a salve, beeswax, and yarrow and a little pinon pitch. Keep it wrapped for 3 days, change the cloth every morning. Thank you, Miss Whitfield. She looked up at me then, and I saw her face fully for the first time, not from across the street, not in the half-shadow of a porch. Her eyes were gray. Not the pale, watery gray that some people have, but a darker gray, like river stones just beneath the surface of moving water. There were lines at the corners of them, not from age but from squinting into distances, from looking at things far away for a long time. Horizons, maybe, or the past. "Celia," she said, "nobody calls me Miss Whitfield except people who are being polite because they've heard things." The honesty of it caught me off guard. I'm not used to people addressing the thing directly. Most people in my experience talk around truth like it's a piece of furniture in the middle of the room. They navigate around it, acknowledge it with their posture, but never actually say there's a chair here. "Caleb Mercer," I said, "and I have heard things, but I've also heard that your poultice fixed Bill Farrow's arm in a day, so I'm inclined to weigh the evidence." She almost smiled. Not quite. The corner of her mouth moved, and then she caught it and put it back where it had been, the way you catch a door that started to open on its own. "Come back in an hour," she said. "I'll have the salve ready." I came back in 40 minutes. I told myself it was because I had nothing else to do. That evening in my room above the copper penny, I wrote in the ledger for a long time. I wrote about her hands, how they moved with a precision that suggested she'd learned to use them in situations where imprecision had consequences. I wrote about the garden, where I'd noticed plants growing that weren't native to the valley. Some of them I'd seen at higher elevations, some I hadn't seen at all, and one that I recognized from a description in a book I'd read years ago about the traditional medicine practices of the Chiricahua people. I wrote about the bone hairpin, and I wrote this, which I can still quote from memory because I've read it back to myself more times than I should. "The town has decided what she is. They decided it before she came back, before she ever had the chance to show them who she'd become. They wrote her story in her absence, and now they're angry that she won't play the character they've cast. This is what people do. They build a cage out of their own fear, and then blame the bird for not fitting inside it." I was being dramatic. I knew it then, and I know it now. But I also wasn't wrong. The next morning I went to Orrin's shop to check on the shoe repair and found him talking to the Reverend, a thin, earnest man named Winslow whose sermons, I'd been told, ran long on certainty and short on mercy. "She has no business practicing medicine of any kind," Winslow was saying when I walked in. He stopped when he saw me, not because I mattered, but because strangers are variables and variables make people cautious. "Morning," I said. "Morning," Orrin said. Winslow just looked at me. "I had Miss Whitfield look at my horse's leg yesterday," I said, because I have a habit of walking directly into conversations I should avoid. My brother used to call it my tallest nail instinct. "The nail that sticks up gets hammered," he'd say, "and you, Caleb, stick up every single time." "That's your business," Winslow said carefully. "It is. She's good. The salve she made took the heat right out of the swelling by this morning." "She has certain skills," Winslow said. "No one disputes that. The question is where those skills come from and what they represent." "They come from knowledge," I said, "and they represent a woman who knows how to help a hurting animal. If that's a problem, I'd be curious to hear why." Winslow looked at me the way clergy look at people they've decided aren't worth converting. With a patience that's really just contempt wearing a borrowed coat. "You're new here, Mr. Mercer. You don't know the history." "No," I said, "but I know a healthy horse when I see one." I took Pepper out of Orrin's yard with one new shoe and one sore leg that was already mending, and I rode east toward Celia Whitfield's house to return the salve jar and the cloth wrapping, and I told myself the whole way there that I was just being polite. But politeness doesn't make your hands shake. And politeness doesn't make you rewrite the page in your ledger 3 times, because you want to get the color of her eyes exactly right. I was supposed to leave the next day. The shoe was fixed. The leg was healing. Garrett's drive wouldn't wait for me forever, and I had no reason to stay in a town that had no use for me and no interest in my opinions. But that evening, as I was settling my account at the Copper Penny, I heard something through the floor of my room. The saloon below was full, and voices carry through pine boards the way water carries through sand, slowly but completely. "Someone's been leaving dead animals on her porch," a voice said. I recognized it, Sykes, the bartender, talking to someone I couldn't see. "Rabbit yesterday, skinned and gutted and just left there." "Kids, probably," the other voice said. "Wasn't kids, the cuts were too clean." Silence. "She won't say anything about it," Sykes added. "She never does." I sat on the edge of my bed with my boots half unlaced and my ledger open on the mattress beside me, and I looked at the page where I'd written the color of her eyes, river stones beneath moving water, and I felt something shift inside my chest. Not toward her exactly, toward the situation, toward the wrongness of it. In the ledger I wrote, "A man who leaves a skinned rabbit on a woman's porch in the dark is not protecting his town. He's confessing something about himself he doesn't have the language for." And below that, "Not leaving tomorrow." I crossed out the line about Garrett's drive. I underlined "not leaving tomorrow" twice. And then I sat there for a long time, listening to the sounds of a town that had decided what it feared and had mistaken that decision for knowing. On the fourth morning, I found Celia kneeling in her garden at a time of day when most of Cimarron Creek was still sleeping off either whiskey or righteousness, depending on which establishment they'd visited the night before. I hadn't meant to come that early. I'm a light sleeper, have been since Kansas, since sleeping too deeply became a luxury I couldn't afford, and I'd woken before dawn to the sound of a coyote calling from somewhere up the ridge east of town. Not a howl exactly, more of a question thrown into the dark and waiting for an answer that might not come. I lay there listening to it for 10 minutes, and when it stopped, the silence that replaced it felt heavier than the sound, the way an empty room feels heavier than a full one. I dressed, pocketed my ledger, and walked. Walking at dawn in the high desert is a particular kind of prayer. The light comes in sideways, copper and thin, and it catches the tops of things first, the ridgelines, the fence posts, the roofs of buildings. So the world looks like it's being built from the top down, piece by piece, as if God is assembling the day and hasn't got to the ground yet. The air smells like sage and cold dirt and the faintest trace of something mineral, something ancient, something the land breathes out while no one is watching. I didn't decide to walk to Celia's house. My feet decided. I've learned not to argue with my feet. They're often smarter than the rest of me. She was kneeling between rows of plants I still couldn't fully identify, some low and leafy, others tall and reedy with seed pods that rattled in the early breeze. Her hands were in the soil up to the wrists, and she was working with a focus that reminded me of the way she'd touched Pepper's leg. Total attention, no wasted movement. She was wearing a faded blue dress with the sleeves pushed up, and her hair was loose, hanging forward over one shoulder in a dark curtain that swayed when she moved. She heard me coming. I know this because her shoulders changed, a tiny lift, a squaring, the way an animal adjusts its posture when it registers a presence, but hasn't yet categorized it as threat or neutral. She didn't turn around. "You walk loudly for a man who lives in the open," she said. "I walk loudly on purpose," I said. "Sneaking up on people is rude." Now she turned, and there was the almost smile again, the one she kept catching and putting back. "You brought the jar," she said, nodding at the clean salve jar I was carrying, which I'd washed twice and dried and wrapped in a cloth because, and I'm being honest here, I wanted an excuse to come back, and returning something is an excuse that nobody can argue with. "I brought the jar. You could have left it on the post." "I could have." She looked at me for a moment, not sizing me up exactly, more like reading me, turning the pages and deciding whether the book was worth continuing. "You want coffee?" she said. "Not a question." "I do." She stood and wiped her hands on a rag that hung from a nail by the door, and I followed her inside. And I want to tell you that I was calm and steady and unaffected, because that's how cowboys are supposed to be in stories, quiet and certain and made of leather and silence. But I wasn't calm. My hands were doing the thing they do when I'm nervous, which is reaching for my ledger so I can write something down. Because writing things down is my way of controlling a moment that feels like it's moving faster than I can track. Her house was small and immaculate, and full of things I wanted to understand. The walls were whitewashed adobe, thick enough to keep the heat out in summer and hold it in during winter. There was a wood stove in the corner with a kettle already warm. She'd been up long before me, I realized. Shelves lined one wall, and on them were jars and bundles and pouches of dried plants, each one labeled in a handwriting that was precise and small. Some labels were in English. Some were in a language I didn't recognize but suspected was Chiricahua, written in a script she'd developed herself, since it wasn't a language that had been written down by the people who spoke it. On another wall there was a single drawing, not framed, just tacked to the adobe with a small nail. It showed a mountain range I didn't recognize, drawn in charcoal with a skill that surprised me. The lines were simple but certain, the way a person draws something they've seen so many times it lives inside their hands. "That's the dragoons," she said, watching me look at it. "The Chiricahua Mountains are behind them. You can't see them from that angle, but they're there." I nodded. "That's where I grew up," she said, and then quieter, the second time. She poured coffee, dark and strong and slightly bitter in a way that woke up parts of my brain I preferred to keep sleeping, and we sat at a small table by the window. The goat was visible outside, still standing on its trough, presiding over the yard with the quiet authority of a minor dictator. "That goat," I said. "Her name is Governor," Celia said, "because she acts like she runs everything and produces nothing of value." I laughed. It came out before I could catch it, loud and graceless and real, and Celia looked startled by it, and then something in her face changed, softened, opened, like a door that had been painted shut for so long that the hinges had forgotten how to move. She laughed too, small and short and private, but real. It was the first time I'd heard her laugh. I wrote it in the ledger that night. She laughs the way people laugh who have forgotten they're allowed to. She told me the story over the course of 3 mornings. Not all at once, not in a rush. In pieces, the way you feed a fire, a stick at a time, watching to see if the flame can hold it before adding more. The first morning, she told me about the homestead. Her family had been ranching near Ojo Caliente, her father, her mother, her 2 older brothers. A hard life, but a good one, the way hard lives can be good when the people sharing them love each other in that ordinary, daily, unspoken way that doesn't make for dramatic stories but makes for real ones. Her father kept bees. Her mother taught all 3 children to read using a Bible and a seed catalog, which Celia said gave her a very particular vocabulary. She could discuss both salvation and drought-resistant squash varieties with equal authority. The raid came in August. She was 8. She told me about it simply, without dramatic pauses, without reaching for my sympathy. The Chiricahua band that took her was led by a man whose name she spoke with respect, Natan. A war leader who was not cruel, but who lived in a time when cruelty and survival had gotten tangled together so thoroughly that separating them was impossible. "He didn't take me to hurt me," she said. "He took me because he'd lost a daughter 2 seasons before to the coughing sickness, and his wife, Ishke, was carrying a grief that was eating her from the inside. Natan thought a child might help. It sounds terrible when I say it in English in this kitchen in this town. But when I say it in the language I learned from Ishke, it sounds like the truest thing I know." I didn't say anything. There was nothing to say that wouldn't have been smaller than the moment. The second morning, she told me about growing up. Ishke, she said, was the most patient woman she had ever known. Not patient in the way that white people use the word, not passive, not waiting, not enduring. Patient the way water is patient, persistent, reshaping things not through force but through presence, through showing up, through being there until the hard edges of the world wore smooth around her. Ishke taught Celia to gather plants, to read the desert the way Celia's mother had taught her to read the Bible, as a text full of meaning that rewarded attention and punished carelessness, to identify which roots drew infection out of wounds, which bark reduced fever, which leaves, chewed and applied, could ease the pain of a burn without leaving a scar. She taught me to pay attention, Celia said, not just to look everyone looks, but to attend, to be present with a thing until it tells you what it needs. Celia told me about Ishke's son, Naki, 2 years older than Celia, who became her brother in every way that mattered. He taught her to move quietly through brush, to track a deer by the way it displaced pebbles, to read weather by the behavior of birds. In return, she taught him English words, and he used them incorrectly and spectacularly. His favorite phrase was absolutely the worst, which he applied to everything from bad weather to beautiful sunsets, always grinning, always aware of the absurdity. "He called me Sticks," Celia said, "because when I first arrived, I was so thin, and my legs were so long that I looked like I was made of sticks held together by stubbornness." "Were you?" "I was," she said. "I still am mostly." I wrote it down that night. Not the details. I didn't feel I had the right to commit her history to my ledger like an accountant recording transactions. But I wrote, "She carries 2 worlds inside her, and neither one has made room for the other. She is the space between them. That space is where she lives, and it is very, very small." The third morning, she told me about coming back. A group of cavalry soldiers and a civilian Indian agent had negotiated her return when she was 19, part of a broader effort to recover white captives, as the Chiricahua were being pushed toward the reservation at San Carlos. She didn't use the word rescued, and I noticed its absence the way you notice a missing step in a staircase. I didn't want to leave, she said. It was the first time her voice changed, thickened, and she looked out the window toward the Gemez Mountains as if she could see through them to the dragoons, to the world she'd been pulled out of. Ishke held me. She didn't cry, I never once saw her cry, but she held me. And she said something I won't translate because some things lose their truth when you move them from one language to another. But the meaning of it was, you have always been my daughter, and the distance between us will never be as real as that. Celia stopped talking. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup and held it the way you hold something when you need your hands to be still and they won't cooperate. The soldiers brought me to Fort Craig, she said, after a silence that lasted longer than any silence I'd ever sat through without filling. And from Fort Craig to an aunt in Santa Fe who I didn't remember and who didn't know what to do with me. I stayed with her for 2 years. I didn't speak for the first 4 months. At all. Not in English. I spoke to myself in Chiricahua at night when she couldn't hear. Because I was afraid that if I stopped speaking it, it would disappear, and then the only home I'd ever really known would stop existing. Languages are homes, Caleb. They're not just words. They're the shape of thinking, the color of remembering. When you lose a language, you lose every memory that was made inside it. I understood that. Not the specifics, I'd never lost a language, but the principle. The terror of losing the container that holds the things you can't survive without. After the 3rd morning, something shifted between us that I didn't have words for then, and barely have words for now. It wasn't romance, not yet. Not in the way stories make it sudden and clean and accompanied by music that swells at the right moment. It was slower than that, quieter. It was the accumulation of small moments of trust, each one building on the last like stones in a wall, where the wall isn't meant to keep anything out but to mark a boundary. Here is the space we share, and here is everything else. I started finding reasons to stay. I told Orrin I'd take some work at the livery. He needed help with the Hollister horses, and I was good with horses. I told Sykes I'd keep my room for the week. I told myself I was staying because the work was steady and the weather was good and I wasn't in any hurry to get to the Picos. But at night in my room, with the ledger open on my knee and the candle burning down, I wrote the truth. I am staying because she makes me want to be the kind of man who stays. And that terrified me, because I hadn't been that man since Kansas, since the field, since my brother. I hadn't told Celia about my brother. I hadn't told anyone about my brother. Some things you carry so long that they stop feeling like things and start feeling like bones, structural, internal, part of the architecture of who you are. You can't set them down because setting them down would mean rebuilding yourself from the skeleton out, and who has the courage for that? But she knew something was there. I could tell by the way she looked at me sometimes, the same way she looked at Pepper's leg before she touched it. Assessing, deciding, where does it hurt and how deep does it go, and is there still enough healthy tissue around it to heal? She never asked. And I loved her for that, not the word, not yet. But the feeling, the gratitude for a person who sees your wound and doesn't demand to unwrap it before you're ready. The trouble started on my 8th day. Reverend Winslow came to see me at the livery. He brought his Bible and his certainty and his expression of sorrowful concern, which I'd come to recognize as the face a man makes when he wants to control you, but needs you to believe he's helping. Mr. Mercer, he said, I feel it's my Christian duty to speak plainly. Then speak. You've been spending time with the Whitfield woman. I have. People have noticed. People notice everything in a town this size. That's not a reason, it's a hobby. His jaw tightened. She is not what she appears. She spent formative years among savages, forgive the term, but scripture is clear about the influence of heathen company on the soul. Whatever she was before she was taken, she is not that anymore. She is something else now, something that does not belong here. I looked at him. I looked at his clean hands and his pressed collar and his eyes that held the particular brightness of a man who has never once doubted himself and considers that a virtue rather than a limitation. Reverend, I said, I've known her 8 days. In those 8 days, she's healed my horse, fed me coffee, and told me the truth about who she is without flinching. In those same 8 days, this town has whispered about her, left dead animals on her porch, and sent you here to warn me away from her. So you'll have to forgive me if I'm having trouble figuring out which side of this conversation represents the Christian position. He left without another word. That night I opened the ledger and wrote, "The Reverend is not afraid of what Celia is. He is afraid of what she proves, that you can survive something terrible, carry two worlds inside you, and still come out gentle. That kind of strength is terrifying to men who have built their authority on the idea that survival requires obedience to their rules." I underlined the last sentence. And then I blew out the candle and lay in the dark, listening to Cimarron Creek settle into sleep, and I thought about the coyote that had called from the ridge on that first morning. A question thrown into the dark, waiting for an answer that might not come. The fever arrived on the second Sunday of October, and it didn't bother knocking. First it took Martin Hadley's youngest, a boy of 4 named Thomas, who went from running in the churchyard to burning on a cot in the span of an afternoon. Then it took the Garza twins. Then the woman who ran the boarding house, and her hired girl, and old Mr. Prout, who'd survived the war and 3 snake bites, and once told me he planned to outlive God himself just to see the look on his face. By Wednesday there were 14 people sick. By Friday, 21. The doctor, a man named Albright, who'd come to Cimarron Creek from Denver 2 years prior with a medical degree, a drinking problem, and an inverse relationship between the two, did what he could. He prescribed quinine. He prescribed rest. He prescribed prayer, which wasn't his field, but he'd run out of options in his own. He moved between beds with the careful, exhausted efficiency of a man who knows that efficiency is all he has left, because the medicine isn't working and the prayers aren't landing, and the fever just keeps spreading like a rumor in a town that knows nothing but rumors. I watched all of this from a distance that shrank by the day. I wasn't sick, not yet, but I could feel the town tightening around the crisis the way a hand tightens around a rope when the load gets heavy. People stopped making eye contact. Conversations became transactional. How many? Who? When did it start? The saloon emptied. The church filled, which Winslow probably considered a small victory, though I doubted God saw it that way. And through all of it, Celia Whitfield stayed on the eastern edge of town, in her adobe house with her garden and her goat, and her jars of things the town didn't trust, and she waited. I went to see her on the Thursday. She was drying roots on a cloth in the sun, long, pale roots that she'd split lengthwise with a knife, and arranged with the methodical precision I'd come to associate with everything she did. "You've heard," I said. "I've heard. Can you help?" She didn't look up from the roots. Her hands kept moving, turning them, adjusting their angle to the light. But I could see the tension in her shoulders, the stillness underneath the movement, the way a river looks calm on the surface while something powerful churns beneath. "I can," she said. "The question is whether they'll let me. And if they won't." Now she looked up. Her gray eyes held something I hadn't seen before, not anger, not hurt, but a weariness so deep it seemed geological. The weariness of a woman who'd spent her entire adult life offering her hands to people who slapped them away and then blamed her for not helping. "Then children will die," she said, "and the town will find a way to make that my fault too." I went to Albright first because Albright, for all his failings, was a pragmatist. Pragmatists listen when they're losing. I found him in the back room of his office, sitting on a stool with his head in his hands. The room smelled like carbolic acid and something worse, the sweet, heavy smell that fever produces when it's been living in a body for days. There were 3 patients in the front room. I could hear one of them breathing in that labored, rattling way that sounds like the body is arguing with itself about whether to keep going. "The quinine's not touching it," he said without looking up. He already knew it was me. I walked loudly, and by now he'd learned my step. "I know someone who might be able to help." "The Whitfield woman." "Yes." He lifted his head. His eyes were bloodshot and ringed with the kind of dark circles that sleep doesn't fix, because the exhaustion isn't physical anymore. It's moral, the exhaustion of watching people suffer and running out of tools. "You know what they'll say," he said. "I know what they'll say. I also know what's happening right now in 3 houses on this street, and what they'll say doesn't matter as much as what they'll bury." He stared at me for a long moment. Then he rubbed his face with both hands, the way a man rubs his face when he's erasing the expression he had and trying to find a new one. "Bring her," he said. Celia came with a basket. I remember the basket because it was beautifully made, woven yucca fiber, tight and symmetrical. with a pattern I later learned was a traditional Chiricahua design that represented flowing water. It was the most openly Apache thing she'd ever carried into town, and she carried it without hesitation, without apology, without looking around to see who was watching. Everyone was watching. She walked beside me down the main street with the basket on her arm and her shoulders set and her eyes forward, and I could feel the town's attention landing on us like a physical weight. The curtains that moved, the doors that didn't quite close, the silence that filled the street the way floodwater fills a dry creek bed, quickly and completely. At the Hadley house, Mrs. Hadley met us at the door. Her face was a war between terror and pride, and terror was winning because her son was burning and pride doesn't cool a fever. "Thomas is worse," she said, to Albright, not to Celia, as if Celia weren't standing right there. Celia didn't react. She walked past Mrs. Hadley into the house with the calm authority of a person who has entered rooms where she wasn't welcome so many times that the unwelcoming has become irrelevant. She knelt beside Thomas's cot and placed her hand on his forehead, that same flat palm touch, measuring, reading, attending. "How long?" she asked. 5 days, Mrs. Hadley said, still to Albright. "He needs to sweat it out," Celia said. "But not the way you've been doing it. Piling blankets on him traps the heat without letting it move. The fever needs to break through the skin, not get caught beneath it." She opened the basket. Inside were bundles of dried plants, a small clay pot with a lid, and a length of cotton cloth she'd soaked in something that smelled sharp and green, not unpleasant, but alive, the smell of something that had been growing that morning. "This is a tea made from the inner bark of the willow and the root of the plant you call boneset," she said, and now she was talking to Mrs. Hadley directly, meeting her eyes with a steadiness that demanded to be met. "The Chiricahua call it Tlo-Chin, the medicine that teaches the body to fight. It won't cure him by tomorrow, but it will help his body do what it's already trying to do." Mrs. Hadley looked at Albright. Albright nodded. It was a small nod, barely perceptible, but it carried the weight of a man setting down a burden he'd been carrying too long alone. Celia brewed the tea over the Hadley stove. She cooled it with a patience that seemed almost aggressive, testing it on her wrist, waiting, testing again, and then she lifted Thomas's head and held the cup to his lips and spoke to him. Quietly, in Chiricahua. Mrs. Hadley flinched. I saw it a full-body recoil, as if the language itself were something dangerous. But Celia kept speaking, and Thomas, 4 years old, burning, barely conscious, drank. Over the next 3 days, Celia moved through Cimarron Creek like weather, inevitable and indifferent to opinion. She went to every house that would open its door, and most of them did, because when your child is shaking with fever and the doctor has admitted he's out of answers, pride becomes a luxury you can't afford. She brewed her tea. She applied her compresses. She spoke to each patient in English when they were conscious and in Chiricahua when they weren't. And when I asked her why, she said, "Because the language you use with a sick person matters less than the certainty behind it. English is my second language. My certainty lives in my first." Albright followed her from house to house, watching, taking notes. To his credit, and this is something I recorded in my ledger because credit should be given where it's earned, he never once tried to take over, never once questioned her methods in front of a patient, never once pulled rank. He simply watched and learned and handed her whatever she needed from the basket when she asked for it. Thomas Hadley's fever broke on the second night. I know because I was sitting on the Hadley's porch when Mrs. Hadley came to the door and said, in a voice cracked open by relief and something else, shame, maybe, or the beginning of it, "He's cooler. He's sleeping. He's breathing right." Celia was already at the next house. By the 5th day, the fever had released its grip on 27 of the 29 people who'd been sick. The 2 who didn't recover, Mr. Prout and an elderly woman named Mrs. Calhoun, had been sick the longest and were, in Albright's judgment, too far gone before Celia arrived. He told me privately that he believed they would have died regardless. I wrote that in the ledger because even grief deserves accuracy. And then came the moment I've been trying to figure out how to write for a very long time. On the 6th day, after the worst had passed, I went to Celia's house in the late afternoon. The light was that deep, amber gold that the desert produces in October, warm and thick and slightly mournful, the light of a season letting go of itself. She was sitting on her porch with Governor the Goat at her feet and a cup of coffee growing cold beside her, and she was looking at the Jemez Mountains the way she always looked at mountains, as if they were letters from someone she missed. I sat down beside her, We were quiet for a while. I'd learned by then that quiet with Celia wasn't empty. It was full in the way that a held breath is full, containing everything that's about to be said but hasn't been yet. "You saved them," I said. "The medicine saved them. I just knew where to find it." "That's the same thing." "No," she said. "It's not. The medicine belongs to a people and a place, and a way of understanding the world that existed for centuries before I ever learned it and will exist for centuries after I'm gone. I'm a carrier, Caleb, that's all. I carry what was given to me and I set it down where it's needed, and then I pick it up again." I wanted to argue. I wanted to tell her that she was more than a carrier, that what she'd done was brave and generous and entirely her own. But she wasn't wrong. And honoring the source of what she knew was part of who she was. Correcting that would have been the same as what the town had been doing all along, deciding who she should be and getting angry when she insisted on being who she actually was. So I said, "Tell me about your brother." She turned to look at me, surprised. Not by the question, but by the timing of it, I think. Or maybe by the word brother, spoken without qualification, without the Apache boy or the one you lived with, but simply brother, as if the relationship were self-evident, which it was. "Naki," she said, and the way she said his name was the way I said my brother's name, with a tenderness that had a fracture running through it, held together by practice and will. "He's alive," she said. "As far as I know, he's at San Carlos, the reservation." She paused. "He sent word last year, through a trader. A message sticks the worst." She smiled, the full smile finally, not caught and put back, not hidden, just there, open and hurting and beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when they've been broken and rebuilt and still somehow function. "Absolutely the worst," I said, remembering what she'd told me. "Absolutely the worst," she confirmed. I told her about my brother that evening. I'd never told anyone. Not the details. Not what happened in the field in Kansas, the argument we'd had, the way he'd ridden out angry and I'd let him go because I was angry too, and anger felt simpler than love in that moment, and I chose the simpler thing. How they found him the next morning at the bottom of a ravine, his horse standing beside him with a broken rein, and the doctor in the nearest town said the fall killed him instantly. But I've never believed that because instantly is a word doctors use when they don't want you to think about the alternative. I told her about the ledger, how I'd started it the day after the funeral because I couldn't stop thinking about all the things I owed him, the apology I never gave, the words I should have said instead of the ones I chose, the simple act of going after him that night instead of standing in the doorway and watching him ride into the dark. "I keep track of debts," I said, because I couldn't pay the only one that mattered. She listened the way she did everything, completely, with her whole self, without interrupting, without offering comfort that would have been easy and meaningless. She just listened, and when I was done, she put her hand on my arm and said, "The debt you think you owe him, it isn't a debt. It's love, and love isn't something you owe, it's something you carry. The difference is that debts get smaller when you pay them, but love gets larger when you carry it. That's why it feels so heavy. It's not punishment, it's growth." I opened the ledger and looked at the pages. Pages and pages of things I owed, things the world owed me, questions I'd asked and never had answered. And then I wrote on the very next clean page. She said love is not a debt. She said it's something you carry and it gets larger. She is right. I have been keeping the wrong kind of ledger. I stayed in Cimarron Creek. Not because the town wanted me. Not because Garrett didn't need me in the Picos. But because staying had become the bravest thing I could do, and I was tired of choosing the easy thing. The town didn't change overnight. These things never do. Mrs. Hadley brought Celia a jar of preserves the week after Thomas recovered, and she delivered it with a stiff formality that suggested the gesture cost her something, which meant it was real. Orrin started sending people to Celia for animal work openly, without the sideways look. Albright began meeting with her once a week to learn about the plants and their uses, and he wrote it all down in a notebook of his own, which Celia found amusing. "Another one who writes things down," she said, looking at me. "The world is full of us," I said. "Winslow never came around. Some stones don't move. You learn to build around them." The skinned animals stopped appearing on her porch. I'd like to say it was because the town's conscience caught up with it, but I suspect it had more to do with the fact that I'd taken to sleeping on Celia's porch on certain nights. Not inside the house. I want that to be clear. because this story is not about that. And whoever had been leaving those offerings had decided that meeting me in the dark was not worth the satisfaction. One night in November, sitting on that porch under a sky so full of stars it looked bruised with light, Celia told me something I've never written in the ledger because some things are too large for paper. "You're the first person," she said, "who heard what happened to me and didn't decide what it meant before I finished telling it." I didn't say anything. There are moments when speaking would be an act of vandalism. Everyone else, she continued, heard the story and immediately knew what I was. A victim, a savage, a cautionary tale, a problem to be solved. You heard the story and asked me what it felt like. That's different, Caleb. That's so different it might as well be a different language. A week before Thanksgiving, a trader came through town with goods from the South. Blankets, tools, dried goods, news. And a message. It was spoken, not written, because the person who sent it didn't write in English, and the language he used didn't fit on paper in any script the trader knew. The trader found Celia in her garden and said, "I've got a word from a man at San Carlos, young man. Said to tell Styx that the mountains remember her and the distance doesn't change what's real." Celia's hand stopped moving. She was holding a sprig of sage, and she gripped it so hard the stem cracked, and the smell of it rose around us like a small green explosion, sharp and clean and alive. She didn't cry. I never saw her cry the same way she never saw Ishke cry. Maybe it was something she'd learned, that tears were private, that grief had a dignity that demanded enclosure. Or maybe it was something else entirely, something I didn't have the cultural vocabulary to understand and didn't need to. Some things you witness without comprehending, and the witnessing is enough. That night, I opened the ledger to the last page. I'd been keeping it for 4 years. 4 years of debts and questions and small reckonings, and I'd filled every page but this one. I'd been saving it, I realized, without knowing what for, waiting for something worthy of the last word.